Hello, and welcome to the beginning of the 2022 season of the NYU Game Center's lecture series. I'm Naomi Clark, and I'm the chair of the department, so it falls to me to kick things off. We've got a really exciting whole season of speakers, and our very first speaker will be introduced in a moment. But first, I just have to say thank you to everyone who makes this lecture series possible. We have some sponsors that help fund it, and those include the Empire State Development Fund, Take-Two Interactive, Parsec, the Peabody Awards, and Fresh Planet.
Clarkson Potter.
And Clarkson Potter. Thank you for remembering one of our latest sponsors. So I'm going to turn it over in a second to Eric Zimmerman, who is going to introduce our speaker. But just so you know, we're going to be doing these once every 3 weeks or so right here in this auditorium. And we're hoping to bring things back in a big way live this year. So if you're joining us on stream, please feel free to put questions and stuff in the chat. But also, if you're in the New York area and you're on stream, consider coming by in person and joining us to get the festivities more lively. All right, Eric Zimmerman, come on down.
All right, thanks for coming. Hey, everybody. I'm super excited to introduce Adrian Hon tonight as the speaker to kick off our series. We've known each other for, I was trying to even remember how we met, but yeah, for many years. And Adrian is a kind of game designer who I think is very at home in New York City, in the sense that your background is not in like sitting in a cubicle working for a AAA studio, you know, pushing pixels around to make 3D worlds. But Adrian, you've really you grew up as games were sort of getting super interesting. I think maybe your first deep dive into getting involved in games was with The Beast, which was the very first alternate reality game that was promoting Steven Spielberg's AI. And you weren't even a designer then. You were just like a super player, writing guides, shepherding the community, and kind of like making your way through that. And that you kind of got the bug there. And Adrian has ended up designing, in my mind, some of the most interesting games that look at this intersection between what happens in the game and the real world. And you know that includes things like Zombies Run, which is like a major hit mobile game where you are running away from audio-based zombies in order to exercise more. And also your game Perplex City, which is like part social puzzle, part collectible card game, part ARG. And very much kind of like in this interesting space between being an experimental game design, a commercial product, and a kind of like an art project too, with a lot of commentary about this sort of dystopian interface between the imaginative world of the game and the real world. And that's why I think it's so interesting that your work has led you to this place now where you're not only designing games, but Adrian has become sort of a major cultural commentator on the idea of how it is that games, game design, gamification, game-based strategies relate to social media technology and contemporary institutions. And your book, You've Been Played, is like an incredible documentation of this moment in time. I think that you go into such interesting detail. We're going to talk about the book. You're going to talk about the book. Then we're going to talk about the book. Then we're going to talk about the book. But I think, Adrian, you were like you were commenting, I think, on a QAnon and saying like, oh, this interesting kind of conspiracy theory really resembles a LARP or a game, and here's why. Like, here's a game designer's point of view on this, and that I think that was one of the origin stories of this whole book, right? And so I think what's really interesting about Adrian's work and why I think you're so much at home here, and we're so happy to have you here, is that you're doing all of the things that we love to do, which is, you know, design experimental and interesting game designs, but also connect what we do as designers to culture at large and have a real voice in the kind of public discourse about the role that games and game design thinking can play in society at large. So I'm incredibly excited to have you here today. Looking forward to your talk. So Adrian is going to talk for a little bit. And then we're going to dialogue a little bit on stage, and then we're going to open it up to a conversation. Please join me in a very, very warm welcome on the stream and here in the room for Adrian Hon. Thank you, Adrian.
Thank you for that introduction. This is really one of the first times I'm talking about this book, so forgive me if it's a little bit unsteady, but it's really exciting to be talking about it, especially here at NYU Game Center. I'm really jealous, honestly, that we don't have something like this in the UK. So you should treasure what you have. So I'm talking about gamification here, and I think most people here will probably be familiar with what gamification is. Eric mentioned my game Zombies Run. This is an example of gamification that usually comes up in a lot of books that even I haven't written, and conferences about gamification as like, hey, here's a good example of a game that motivates people to get running more and making exercise more exciting. And that's really the idea of gamification, of using ideas from game design for non-game purposes. So in practice, things like experience points, missions, badges, achievements, leaderboards, that sort of thing. So obviously, gamification is around today all over the place. I got a Peloton during lockdown, like a lot of people. This is my profile. And, when you go to the profile, you've got the achievements there. So I've done some workouts, good for me. There's some streaks. If you use Duolingo, obviously, you'd be very familiar with getting experience points and leveling up and streaks as you learn a new language. And this is like a really big part of Duolingo. This is a new game. I don't know whether they call it a game, a new app called Locksmith Plus, I think from Ubisoft. And this is not really like Rock Band. This is a game that teaches you how to play the real guitar. So you're playing like an actual guitar and it's listening to your audio, to the sounds you're making, and it gamifies that. So that's kind of the traditional, this is like kind of good gamification as it exists now. And gamification has obviously been around for a while. I think, one of the starting points of gamification was Foursquare back in 2009, this sort of social app where you could check in to real locations and unlock badges and get points and become mayor of a real location. And so back when gamification started, when the term was coined in the late 2000s, I think most people kind of saw it as a sort of harmless curiosity, like a fun way to increase engagement in social apps like this and Stack Overflow, and Twitter. So we went from this in 2009 to forms of gamification today that are maybe less visible but far more pervasive, like this from an Amazon warehouse that was taken last year. So you aren't allowed to take video in Amazon warehouses, so this is kind of rare. And so this is a video from someone who works, picking and packing boxes in Amazon, and you can see as they pick units and they level up and they can get, they can make history by picking 1 million units. Amazing. What a fun game. And this is from last month in another Amazon warehouse. When you want to quit Amazon, but you don't want to abandon your virtual pets. So as you work in Amazon, you very, very, very slowly unlock and level up your pets. And this is sort of like surprisingly not terrible looking Tamazilla game. There's several games that exist in Amazon fulfillment centers. They're called FC games, and but it's sort of quite difficult to kind of get hold of these details. So if anyone sees a video like this, please send it to me. So how did this happen? How did we go from something that was just kind of harmless and fun to people's work in Amazon warehouses being gamified? I think there's really two reasons. So the first reason is not terribly original. It's basically that from about 2007, when we started getting smartphones like the iPhone, when 3G and mobile broadband and landline broadband started becoming more common, we started seeing the adoption of Web 2.0 technologies and just a lot of sensors that provided the data on which gamification works. So when I was a kid, I used to have like a little pedometer because I was a bit of a nerd, and that pedometer didn't talk to anything. It was just like a dumb device on my belt. And now, if you buy a pedometer, if you have a pedometer app, it's kind of quite difficult to get something that measures your steps that doesn't also try to compare it to your friends or gamify it in some way. So there's a technological aspect to why gamification has become much more common. It's because we are just swimming in data, and all of our activities from personal life to the workplace have been digitized. And once you've done that, you can gamify quite easily. But that's been covered quite a lot in other media, so I don't really want to dwell on that. I think the other reason for why people are more outraged or more surprised by gamification in Amazon or in Uber or in Microsoft Office is the triumph of gaming culture. And what I mean by this is the way in which video games went from being kind of a frivolous distraction in the 1970s. I mean, this is a very compressed history, to a sort of dangerous hobby in 80s and 90s and 2000s, to becoming, I think, the dominant form of entertainment and culture in the 21st century. And so it's really not new. I think we all know that when new art forms appear, people are scared of them. They think it's going to cause a downfall of humanity. So when we first saw jazz music and rock music and cinema and novels, people were, scared of these new art forms. And for video games, the way it's happened is that we've kind of gone from this, murder by PlayStation, ban these evil games. I mean, this is a Daily Mail. You would expect them to say that. But, there was just a lot of stuff in the media and on the BBC, just like, well, games, how are they banned, right? And so a lot of people who make games now and who make gamifications now grew up in a time when all they heard was games are bad, right? And they kind of knew, well, games aren't that bad. They aren't like turning us into killers, right? So what's interesting is that actually, I think you're more likely to see headlines like this in the media today, where video games are just good for you. Like, all video games are good, right? There's no video game that's bad, really. And if you play video games, then you're going to become more intelligent, you're going to become more empathetic, you're going to, be happy. Obviously, the truth is somewhere in between. I'm not going to sort of go into that. But the point is that when I talk about the triumph of gaming culture, what I mean is not so much that it makes lots of money or that people play games a lot. It's that it has sort of assumed this point where its perceived importance to humanity has become really high, where people can say things like video games are good for well-being in a way that no one finds particularly strange, right? Everyone wants to hear this. And so I think it's this triumph of video games that has led inadvertently to the rise of gamification. And I'm going to reverse a bit in time to 2007, 2008. And so this was, again, about the time when the term gamification was coming about. And you started seeing game design mechanics also being used in non-profits and for charities. And so one interesting case was Obama's first presidential election campaign. And you can see it more clearly here, where volunteers who were calling up people to get them to vote for Obama, had this phone bank system, and the more calls you made, obviously, you leveled up and you get these points. And it's not an especially sophisticated, form of gamification, but it's gamification. I mean, I think that's, what you would see in terms of the points and the levels. And I'm not saying that gamification won Obama the presidency. Like, I think what is interesting is that some people thought it helped at the time. People thought that gamification was effective in social change, right? achieving progressive goals. And so maybe it did help. I don't know. It's difficult to know whether, like, to prove whether gamification had a big impact on Obama's presidency. But this sort of thing gave gamification a really positive glow at the time. People were, hey, this is a good thing. You know, and we saw a rise in gamification and what I would call sort of utopian gamification almost, as a way to try and improve the world. And so this was a game by Ken Eklund and Jane McGonigal in the 2000s called World Without Oil. And it's an alternate reality game that asked players to imagine solutions to climate change in a fictional world. And so this was covered like really well in the media. People were just fascinated by this game. And they're like, wow, maybe games can fix climate change. Like they can change behavior and generate and crowdsource solutions to these things. And so it really, I think, kind of reached a bit of a zenith in 2010. And I want to kind of focus on a pair of talks, which were sort of like incidentally like involved with like the TED conference. And so the first one was by game designer Jesse Shell. And he imagined a world where everything in life was gamified. You woke up and you brushed your teeth and that was gamified. And then you went downstairs and you ate breakfast and that was gamified. And you went on the bus and that's gamified. And your work's gamified. Just everything is gamified. And if you watch it now, it seems like a parody, like Black Mirror before Black Mirror. Just a kind of way to be provocative. It's kind of difficult to know whether he's like joking in this talk. But then it ended up with this really weirdly hopeful and genuine note where he says it could be that all these gamification systems that he's imagining are all just crass commercialization, you know, as a way to make money, increase engagement. But he says like maybe it's possible that they'll inspire us to be better people if the game systems are designed right. And I'm like, I mean, anything's possible. Like, you know, you could do that. Turning the world into a game could make us better people, or it could be terrible. And I think this is sort of like where I'm getting at, which is like how it turns out is not really about the game. It's about a question of the world's power structures and political and economic power. And I kind of think that Jesse Shell was being a bit deliberately short-sighted about not thinking about why organizations would want to gamify everything. Because, I don't know, they like seeing the numbers go up and line go up. Another influential talk given at practically the same time, kind of very strange timing, was much more straightforwardly optimistic. And it built off Jane's work on World Without Oil and other games like Urgent Evoked, and basically said that video games, all video games, really, not just her games, but just Mario, Halo, you know, Warcraft, I'm trying to think of games from like 10 years ago, make their players better people and train them to work together. So just to kind of recap that, the argument was just by playing a game, really any game, you become a better person and you become more capable. And so her argument, and I'm trying to say this as fairly as possible, her argument was if we can harness that power towards good ends, if we channel the millions of hours that people spend playing games into saving the world, ideally through a new kind of game, we could save the world, a kind of utopian gamification. And so she said, if we want to solve problems like hunger, poverty, climate change, global conflict, obesity, I believe that we need to aspire to play games online for at least 21 billion hours a week by the end of the next decade. In other words, 2 years ago. And I think it's safe to say, in the year of our Lord, 2022, that this has not happened, right? And I'm not trying to dunk. It's more just saying that I think I wouldn't say games have made anything worse. I'm just not really sure that they've really made anything better. And so it's clearly the case that no one has really designed these games effectively that channel people into solving these problems. It's really hard to do. But at the time, the point is, at the time, in the late 2000s to really the mid-2010s,
people were really inspired by this message. People were just really excited. They were really ready to hear that games, which were demonized, were actually really good. And so there was this kind of positive glow, this aura around video games and gamification. They were empowering, they were technology, they were good. And this is actually before we all started hating Facebook. So, this was around, the sort of revolutions in Egypt where like Twitter, overthrew, the dictator. People just thought like social media and technology was good. And so I kind of want to have a bit of an aside. I think that gamification is a charismatic technology. That's the reason why it's been so powerful. And a charismatic technology, it's not my term, is one where the claims of the technology and its charisma manage to dazzle people into supporting what is obviously, even at the time, a really flawed project. So a good example of this is the one laptop per child project. And this was announced back in 2005 by MIT Media Lab co-founder Nicholas Negroponte. And the idea behind this laptop is that it would transform and disrupt education around the world for every single child in the world, but especially those in the global south. And it would cost $100. And so this would be like a hand-cranked, like crank-powered laptop that would transform education. And it didn't. It was just. It turns out that we can't even make a $100 laptop now that is really very robust and can survive being used by kids. There were all sorts of problems. The laptop had problems of internet connectivity, it had unreliable hardware, bad software, it was underpowered, the teachers weren't trained, the laptops cost too much. Every time the software, the OS on the one laptop per child got updated, it would delete all the user's data. So that's not great. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. But despite all these problems, no one wanted to hear that this couldn't work because it was just so charismatic. The people funding it were like, but just imagine if we could just give every kid a laptop that could teach them how to program and go to Wikipedia. They'll all learn programming themselves and will change the entire world. And so there's this aspect of nostalgic design in charismatic technology where people think, hey, I grew up learning computers, so if I just go and give any kid a computer, then they'll do that as well. So if you're interested in this, I'd really encourage you to buy this book about it, The Charisma Machine. And so I think gamification and utopian gamification is a charismatic technology. I think that's why something that you would have expected to go away, because really, why are people so attached to points and badges and missions and leaderboards? Why are they still here? Why are people still using these and expected them to work? And I think it's because people just really want it to work. They really want to believe that video games and gamification can actually solve things. So the glow around utopian gamification never really went away. It just got transferred to gamification as a whole. So we reached this point in the early 2010s where gamification seemed like maybe it could save the world, and video games, instead of being bad for you, were actually good for you. And so the successes of one strengthened the other. And that charismatic glow surrounding gamification is still there even now. I went to this gamification conference. They invite me sometimes, back like 3 years ago. And I wrote this down because I just thought it was so funny. One speaker said, why not be inspired by games? Games are really engaging. Games are played, and when we play, we express our own core truths. And that sounds really nice. Everyone nodded. Core truths. And then she said, that's really useful for market research. Right. So that's just like what are you saying? So basically, people nodding. It's like, wow, that's great. So thanks to the technological advances I mentioned before, gamification was built into pretty much everything possible, which in practice means a lot of things. This is something that I got a couple of weeks ago. Adrian, get as many exercise minutes as you can this month. Exercise, whatever you exercise in August, it's not enough. Just go and exercise more, and otherwise you'll lose this challenge, right? If you've got an Apple Watch, by default, it is gamified. You will get messages at 11:30 p.m. at night saying, hey, how about you go and burn 200 more calories to close your rings? Go for a run at midnight, which seems ridiculous. So there's a few problems with this. The first is it's just unhealthy. It's just really stupid, right? Like you should not be just leveling up your exercise every month. Eventually, it's going to be too much. The second is it's on by default, and it's not really obvious how you turn it off. You can just go into the Watch app on the phone and do the thing, blah, blah, blah. So, I got this when I was reading Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed, of all things. Hey, why not extend your reading streak and hit your... By default, the goal for reading per day is 5 minutes, by the way. So, and I didn't set that. I was like, what is this? Why am I getting this thing? So, that's just, and that's every iOS device, that's every Apple Watch, it's every Fitbit, it's every Android smartwatch, it's every, smartphone. Everything has these things built in. You can ignore them, but they're there. Retail apps, in China, I would say China is really kind of ahead of the curve in terms of gamification. It's built into the Chinese super apps, which are these sort of combinations of retail and social network and finance apps. And these apps basically give you discounts and bonuses and so on. But in the West, obviously, we have health insurance is gamified now. Education is gamified. I could spend 2 hours talking about gamification in all sorts of heinous places. This is, but yeah, in China, it's kind of pretty amazing. There needs to be more sort of research into what's going on there. One area that has been really interesting to me, because I have a background in neuroscience and experimental psychology, has been brain training apps, brain training games. These are games where you play mini games and maybe you get smarter, but probably not. These games will say they're based on scientific research, but actually, if you look into the research on gamification and brain training apps in general, it's really pretty thin. It's quite difficult to research this stuff. And yet, the positivity around games has gotten to the point where it really overwhelms the need for actual evidence, right? It's just I don't know, we studied some people who play Animal Crossing, and they seem to be happy, so all games are good, right? It's it seems misleading. So this was a game, a brain training game, Lumosity, that got fined $2 million a few years ago by the FTC for deceptively saying that it would protect against Alzheimer's disease and so on. The fine was meant to be $50 million, but they didn't have enough money, so they could only pay $2 million. And so it's more, I guess what I'm getting at is that I don't think it's such a terrible thing to go and gamify your own life if that's what you want, if you choose to do that. But it would be nice if it actually worked and it wasn't false advertising. And it would be nice if it, didn't just make you feel bad all the time. So, so that's not great, sort of lifestyle, health and fitness gamification that doesn't work very well. But really, I started with that video of an Amazon warehouse. And what I want to talk about is coercive gamification. This is gamification where you don't really have any choice in playing. And you see it a lot in workplaces these days. And it's much less visible because workers aren't really allowed to share the information. They've got NDAs. But it has a lot more impact than lifestyle gamification because it affects the lives of hundreds of millions of workers for their entire working day, and it affects their compensation. So a few years ago, Uber had about 4 million drivers around the world, and many of them have their work gamified to a lesser or greater degree. And there's a reason why they call it a quest, right? Pick your quest. It could just be called, pick your incentive. It could be called pick your bonus or whatever, but it's called pick your quest. And it's because they know that people know what a quest is. Like everyone understands the language of games now. Like we've all played games. And this is not optional. Like you just have these quests, and you have supposedly some choice in the bonus that you get if you complete 40 or 50 trips, in this time period. But what is interesting with a lot of gig economy companies is that they've realized, I think, that you can obfuscate people's compensation by gamifying it, right? So instead of saying we're going to pay you $20 an hour or $15 an hour or something really like clear metric of pay, if you go and add in these missions and say, hey, if you go and fulfill this thing, then we'll give you a bonus, and that bonus is actually a not insignificant proportion of your total compensation, then you kind of have to play the game, right? And the game is not transparent. It's not a fair game. And I think one of the things that is really upsetting, honestly, is that it preys on people's understanding that games are meant to be fair. Like if you play a good board game, a good video game, you assume that the rules are fair and that people have a chance of winning, right, and doing well and completing the quest. But that is not the case in workplace gamification. That's not how these games are designed in the first place. When you go and work at a call center, like 3 million other people in the US, and your work is being managed in this way, like you don't know whether these gamified metrics, are being changed behind the scenes, right? And so, this kind of work is being increasingly gamified to punish mistakes and make people compete against each other. And of course, this has always happened. I'm not saying that there haven't always been rewards and punishments in workplaces. We've had them for centuries. What is different are the aesthetics. They use video game aesthetics instead of other aesthetics. And I think that's because, like I say, they know that people understand how games work. And this is part of a trend to like a greater levels of quantification in the workplace in real time. And so what some people call pointsification. And so this is not like strictly gamification, but it very easily becomes that. And so, if you keep control of the call and you get 2.857134 points, I don't know why it's that precise, people kind of understand how that works. And people internalize that surveillance, right? In the past, when people's productivity at a factory was being monitored, it was being done so maybe at the end of the day or the end of the week. That's how Taylorism worked. But with digital Taylorism, when we're measuring people in real time, you can use AI to monitor people's call interactions every second. You can have something that feels much more reactive, like a game. And this kind of surveillance has become more literal. In the case of COVID, surveillance technology has followed people home in their laptops. There's this system called Hubstaff that lets employers monitor every time a worker presses a key or moves a mouse, or even takes a photo every 10 minutes to make sure you're still in front of the computer at home. Another company, Crossover, goes a step further, and it's inspired by athletes using Fitbits to fine-tune their fitness. They've developed a tool called Work Smart to increase focus and gamify productivity. And it takes a photo every 10 minutes. Now, you might think maybe this is just for low-paid workers, but actually Crossover is for programmers. It's not for call center workers. And even workers at Barclays Investment Bank have been subjected to gamification through a Sapience surveillance system. But it is mostly low-paid workers, like those at Uber and Lyft, who are having gamification affect their work. And Amazon is actually a really interesting case, because I have to be really specific about how this works, which is that you don't actually have to go and play this game where you're sort of like flying your virtual dragon in work at Amazon. Like the way it works, as I understand it at Amazon, is that you have your workstation and you have a monitor there. And either the monitor is off or you turn it on and you play the game. You can't play another game. You can't watch Netflix. You can't watch TV. You're either incredibly bored or you're slightly less bored and slightly more manipulated. And so it's really not as much of a choice as it seems. I will say that I think we have to at least entertain the possibility that these games might make the work fun for some people. Like, I don't think that I would find it fun, but maybe some people do find it fun. And people have asked Amazon workers, hey, is this good? Do you like them? And some people say, yeah, it does actually make it a bit less boring. And other people say that it exacerbates the feeling of the endlessness of the work, and it just makes them even more depressed. So another thing that we have to consider is maybe the problem with these games is that they're just really badly designed. Maybe if Amazon had really good game designers, they could actually make packing boxes for Amazon really good. Could you make driving for Uber really fun? Could you do all these things? And I think the short answer is, I don't think it's possible. There's this VR game that came out a few years ago called Ship It. And it was basically a virtual reality game where you gamify being an Amazon worker. And it's kind of like playing Tetris. You get these strange shaped boxes, and you've got to put them into another box. And every 5 minutes it will kind of change, so it never got boring. Like, Amazon could do that. It could change its entire factories and warehouses to make the act of packing boxes like really interesting and challenging. But of course, they're not going to do that because that's kind of inefficient, right? So, they don't actually want to give people any choice or any challenge. So I don't think you really can do this better. But, that's kind of the best way of looking at it. Actually, most people, a lot of gig workers for Amazon have no choice. If you deliver packages for Amazon, then you have to install this app on your smartphone called Mentor. And apparently, gamification drives engagement and shared accountability. So gamification is good. I want to end with one note about a really interesting thing that happened around GitHub and gamification. So GitHub is it has almost 100 million programmers who use it to store their code and collaborate on code. And GitHub used to have this streak feature, where if you went to someone's profile, you could see how many days in a row that they had contributed code or edited code on the website. Very small kind of gamification, barely gamification at all, but still gamification. And they abruptly removed it in 2016. Just one day, it just disappeared. And so someone did a study to look at what happened. Like, did it make any difference? And the fact is, it made a massive difference. They found that programmers abandoned long-running streaks of activity. Right? When this was no longer on the website, they just stopped checking in every day to go and change one character or to write a line of code. Weekend activity decreased. Days in which developers made a single contribution became less common. Synchronization of streaking behavior in the platform decreased, so where different users were working at the same time. And they looked at a set of software developers that were publicly pursuing a goal to make contributions for 100 days in a row, and they found that those developers abandoned that quest after this was removed. And they concluded by saying, any game designer must consider that users may engage with new games in unexpected ways. Some users may focus their efforts on collecting points and badges to the detriment of the actual content of their activity. Some users may chase the rewards of gamification to an unhealthy degree. Long streaks of uninterrupted contributions may lead to burnout. This is what gamification can do. Like, it can actually do this. It wasn't even coercive. You could just ignore it, but it was on by default. So we have to be careful. Millions of people use these things. It doesn't work on everything, but it works on a lot of people. And it even works in video games. So game designers need to care more. Slight twist, two final twists. A couple of months back, they reintroduced gamification to GitHub. Great news. So now there's achievements. People are really happy about this. And if you go into the forums, you'll see what they talk about. Now, with this, in the comments with this video for the warehouse game, some people were like, wow, I really want to work at Amazon now. It looks really fun to go and like collect virtual pets. And so you're like, wow, were people like fooled by this game? And so the person who posted the video said, someone said, guys, it's not as fun as you think. You can't play with them or anything. It's just to make you work faster with no reward. Yeah, they don't know. So people do find out eventually. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian. Let's come on over here to the chairs. Logan, should we just have this one mic between the two of us?
I'll move the other one.
Oh, okay. So, wow, thank you so much for that. I think we're now using these mics that we have to turn on. Hello, hello, hello. Yes, hello. So, wow, that was what a great talk. I think it's so interesting to hear. Yeah, such a smart, like it's such a big topic, and it's so interesting to hear your very kind of wide-ranging and focused take. There's so much for us to talk about. I've been trying to map out how this conversation could work. So one thing is, it's so tempting to start talking about these kind of big cultural politics and the Black Mirror reality that we live in. But before we get there, because we have an audience full of game designers, I want to talk to you a little bit about your actual work as a game designer that you talked about a little bit at the beginning. And you also write about in your book in such an interesting way. I wanted to bring out some of those elements to our conversation. So, for example, your game Zombies Run that you talk about, that you mentioned in the video, and I think was the big inspiration for our poster for your talk as well. I don't know, the poster was like someone in a car, so I'm wondering if it's like the critique of Uber gamification along with the Zombies Run.
Yeah.
It was an interesting kind of like, remixing of some of your projects and ideas. You write about in Zombies Run, I think what's so interesting about your work is that there's such a great kind of experimental edge, that you're looking for ways that games can impact people's lives, integrate, diffuse into people's lives in interesting ways. So you write about, for example, and I know I'm doing a lot of background. We're going to get to Adrian talking in a second, but you write about, for example, at the time that you were working on Zombies Run, there were other mixed reality games. And you made the observation with your team that those games often were fighting against people's normal lives, right? For example, what was the game? You were like, to play this game, we had to get 4 friends, go to a park, be in the park together. Then we were going to play this interesting, whatever it was, game, Scavenger Hunt or Tron Light Cycles or...
Yeah, so there's back when the iPhone came out, everyone got really excited because it had GPS in it, it had internet. So like when you have those two things, you can do location-based games, multiplayer location-based games. And there's this one game which I thought was really cool. It's still a cool idea, called Seek and Spell. It used to be called Scramble until I think Hasbro's lawyers got in touch. And so it was like Scrabble in the real world. So it would place these letter tiles on a map, and then you and 3 other friends would run around, this area collecting those tiles, and you would collect them to form words where you get points. So it's like, wow, that's a kind of cool game.
Right. Someone's running after the S, and everyone wants that letter first. Yeah. So you're.
Yeah, and so then I remember like thinking, okay, I got to get some friends together to play this. I'm like, none of my friends have iPhones, and they don't live near me, and we can't really get 3G, and maybe we can play it once, maybe.
Right.
And I remember seeing some friends like on Twitter in Seattle or San Francisco, those kind of people who were just like, yeah, we played Seek and Spell, all today, and we had such a great time. I'm like, no one else can play this game. It's just too difficult and too expensive. There's another game called Cash and Seek, which was designed in Japan. And it was what a lot of people think Zombies Run actually is. And so it showed a map of the real world, and it would put treasures on that map. And the idea is that you would go and run around the real world and collect these treasures, a bit like Pokemon Go. And I remember playing it for like 5 minutes. And then it put a treasure down some like road that I didn't want to go down. I was like, this game is not fun enough for me to go and run down this road.
Right, risk your life because there's not a good sidewalk for running with the cars coming at you.
Exactly. And I was just like, I just don't want to play a game where it tells me where to run. I'm just not interested in that. And I think that obviously people do play Pokemon Go. That's a different story. But with running, actually, if you're a runner, you just want to, you probably have like 3 or 4 different routes, right? And you don't change them that much. I just have my favorite routes. I just go around them the same way. So the problem that runners have is not so much, I have no idea where to run, and please make my run more interesting, by sending me into new places. It's more like, I'm running around this place, and it's a bit repetitive, and so I'm going to listen to music or listen to a podcast, right? And I really don't want to be looking at my phone when I'm running, because that's unsafe, and it's kind of...
To see where the treasure is popping up.
To see where the treasure is popping up. It's just like, obviously we don't want to do that. You can't really do that until you have like heads-up displays. So with Zombies Run, I just remember thinking, we have a really small team. We don't like have a lot of money. So what can we do here? We can just do audio, and that's okay because that's the one thing we know people actually do when they're running. They listen to music or podcasts, and they have headphones in. So we're not asking a lot there. And so there's a really nice kind of combination that just came out of my like frustration, I guess. I was just like, why has no one like done this? Like, why are people trying to make me look at my phone when I run? Like, I'm not going to do that.
And that's what's so interesting. Thanks for leading us through that design process. I guess that's what I find so interesting is that often when we're trying to make an experimental game, create games for new contexts, we often have an instinct to kind of like wishful thinking about what we can layer on like the work we can make players do or the conceptual hoops that they have to jump through. And I think that Zombies Run is so interesting as a game that you found the sweet spot, the sort of intersection of solving an actually really interesting and original problem, but with a means that was like so intuitive and respected the context in which it was going to be played. And it's such interesting example of design thinking that was in the end also very commercially successucul.
Yeah.
I think that game is still like a huge hit for you.
We still have like hundreds of thousands of players like every month. I mean, I think my like superpower, as a game designer is I'm just a really lazy gamer. Like I just can't. There's this game that was really interesting where it's like an augmented reality game for the iPhone. And the idea is it would like call you up and it would go and say, okay, Agent X, we need to go and pick up this package 100 meters down the road. So can you start out by doing that? I'm like, I just opened this app. You're telling me to walk down the road. I don't have these shoes on and it's raining. Like, no, I'm not going to do that. Like you.
Okay, but I'm going to call you out on this
Yeah.
because interestingly, the other game of yours that I knew from your earlier days that I always found so inspiring was Perplex City.
Yeah.
That did seem like a game that was asking a lot of players, right?
Yeah.
Because it asked you to become part of an online community. It asked you to collect physical cards. It asked you to sort of solve puzzles in real time, be attentive to updates as they happen, and kind of like pace yourself with this. But you must have run into all of the problems of an alternate reality game and socially sourced puzzles, and some people were all the hardcore people led it and ruined it for everybody else. So and how does that intersect with some of these issues you're raising about the lazy game player?
I mean, I don't know that we really solved it because it was never played by like millions of players.
Okay.
It had like a lot of alternate reality games. It had like a few thousand like really hardcore players, but the stuff they did was just so interesting. Like it created a lot of media attention, off the back of which we kind of sold the stuff that was much easier to get into, which was the puzzle cards. And so, whenever I read about games like EVE Online, and everyone's always like, "Oh, EVE Online, it's the most amazing game that no one plays." But that's not, I mean, people do have fun playing that game,
Right.
and it generates really interesting stories. So with Perplex City, I think that the difference with Perplex City is obviously it was mostly online. And so I think you can get people to do a lot of stuff if they're just sitting in front of the computer. I think if you try and get someone to do anything kind of physical, it gets quite difficult. The reason why Zombies Run works is because it's a fitness game. And people...
You're piggybacking on a physical activity that people already do.
Yeah, and people just, at the moment, care a lot about their fitness, and we are piggybacking off the desire for a lot of people to try and get fit, and running is a pretty cheap activity, and so people are already motivated. You know, we know that people already want to do this. I think with games, it's a bit trickier because they want to have fun, but they have a lot of choices. So that's the tricky thing.
Yeah, and it's funny, a fork in the road. It's like, what kind of game designer do I want to be? Do I want to be like a, I don't know, like a mass market pop music star where I can like get my music out to a lot of people? The pleasure of Perplex City is that you become like, it's like the cult leader model of being a game designer, where you have this very dedicated relationship,
Yeah.
but with a small number of people, but you're sort of like really connecting with them.
Yeah.
Which I guess is I don't mean that in a
No,
creepy way.
no.
But you end up having this like deep insight into a small number of players.
Yes, and I think that games like Blaseball are kind of like that. I think that's kind of another interesting game where it's not got a massive number of players, I think, but the people who play it absolutely love it and they spend all their time on it.
Let's circle out a little bit. I want to talk about. So anyway, thank you. It's always so interesting to talk to you about your work, and we can return to that if some of you have questions about that. I wanted to start, expanding a little bit what we're talking about. Again, what's so interesting about your talk, I think, is that many people take a strong stance on this, right? Like you mentioned Jesse Schell and Jane McGonigal. And I think Jesse was actually not so ironic. I think he was actually quite positive. But people take gamification is good. There's plenty of people now that are like social media is evil, technology is bad, the surveillance state, the big brother. And you have I think you have an interesting, I don't want to say you're the loyal opposition, but you don't take such a strong stance, positive or negative. You put out your game Zombies Run as an example of what you call good gamification. You use Duolingo, for example.
Yeah.
And you have this interesting formula in your book that's about good gamification. I don't remember it exactly, but I remember that it was about like quality design or quality experience. And then the interesting part is that if you have an intrinsically motivating core activity.
Yeah, if you have a pre-existing motivation to do the thing. So if you try and make someone play Duolingo and they have no interest in learning another language, it's not going to work because it's not a very good game at all. But if you are really motivated to learn, Japanese because you met someone, or you're going to move to Japan, you're going to work there, then it kind of does work because you're already really motivated to do that. And so when you have that kind of that synchronicity, then it works well.
And I think this kind of gets at, for me, one of the very core issues of gamification, which is, what is it encouraging you to do, really? And you mentioned in your book, I think, Alfie Kohn, did he write Punished by Rewards?
Yeah.
So this behavioral psychologist, and correct me if I'm wrong, you know more about this than me, but he says something like, if you give a kid a candy bar for cleaning up their room as a reward, right? You're gamifying it. Here's clean up the room, do the thing I want you to do, here's a candy bar. A couple things happen. First of all, they will only clean up the room if you give them the candy bar. So suddenly what should be a daily activity has suddenly become something that they often will demand a bribe for. But the deeper problem is that they don't end up getting the intrinsic idea of cleanliness as just an important personal value. Instead, they are doing the activity for the candy bar.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of keeping my room clean is itself a vehicle for getting candy bars. It's no longer about enjoying cleanliness, enjoying the products of cleanliness. In fact, they'll do in some of your examples of your last example of GitHub, where I'm going to go and change one character and then log out, just because to keep my streak going. Whatever superficial cleaning I need to do to get the candy bar is what I'm going to focus on.
It sort of instrumentalizes the activity that you're trying to encourage.
Right.
And one of the things I talk about is that, like, I sort of talk about like trying to keep rewards and punishments small. Like, you know, I definitely recommend Alfie Kohn's book. It's kind of really radical. He basically says you just shouldn't have any rewards or punishment for anything ever.
Right, including like in a classroom. He's like, teachers have it wrong, parents have it wrong.
Yeah, no grades. You shouldn't even have, I think he was like, you shouldn't even like give people praise. It's kind of, and like I'm not saying that you should do that. I'm just like, wow, this guy is like going hardcore.
I agree with
you
that.
Know?
I think grades are extremely problematic. I'm learning about them a lot from Alexander King in the back there.
So you should definitely read that. I think that, you know, his critique is of behaviorism. He's like, look, if you go and just try and motivate people through rewards and punishment, you're treating people like, you know, rats in a cage, basically.
Okay, well this was the thought that I had when reading your book, because sometimes when I'm trying to tell people like what is wrong with gamification, because it's so interesting what you started your talk with, that there is this kind of triumph of gamer culture. Well, I'm going to talk about that in a second, but what I often say to people is, you know, every design implies a model of what it means to be human. So for example, if you're designing a chair, what are you saying about what it means to be human? How accommodating, how inclusive is your model of the human body? Or how rich are you are expecting someone to be? Or how sustainable are you expecting this process to be? How long do you expect someone to keep this chair before it breaks down and they have to buy a new one, right? So there's models of what it means to be human. And the gamified model of what it means to be human is, as you say, it's the rat in the cage pushing the button for that. It's like this incredibly impoverished idea of being human. And to me, that's a fundamental critique of gamification.
Yeah, and it sort of extends out of just the tech industry as a whole, which is that, you know, it uses, you know, people will often ask me, hey, you studied psychology, like how do you use your like amazing psychology knowledge to, which I don't have, to be clear, you know, to design games? I'm like, I don't use any of it. And companies that say they have psychologists on staff, it's just, I don't believe that they actually do anything. I think what Facebook is doing and what Google is doing are just doing like 1,000 A/B tests. And it kind of works because they have the scale to test those. And that's kind of what is happening with a lot of gamification, where, you know, like a lot of Silicon Valley companies like Duolingo, they're not really innovating. They just sort of go and copy what everyone else does. And they keep on tweaking the numbers to find out, oh, it looks like if we change this number, people do this other thing. And I think it's become so internalized in terms of designers that people are just like, yeah, of course that's how behavior works. You motivate people through rewards and punishments. And it actually took me, like, when I was writing the book, I was like, like I need to go and like remind myself, like, you know, because we didn't teach people didn't teach behaviorism like in psychology. Everyone's like, yeah, that old thing, that's not like how people get motivated. We have things like self-determination theory now, which says, okay, people are motivated through autonomy, where people have agency to control their lives, and through mastery, where people love to feel like they've mastered a new skill, or connectedness, you know, where people feel like they're being worth, you know, they're helping their friends and their community. And if you can sort of map those onto really good games. So if you look at a game like Elden Ring, right? Elden Ring doesn't have achievements. You know, it's just incredibly difficult. But you can say, all right, well, it's really sort of targeting. It's not a single. Well, I was going to say it's not a multiplayer game, but you have all the signs about dogs and stuff. And so you have these elements which are not. You don't really get any rewards in Elden Ring, honestly. You don't get any points, but you have this feeling that I'm getting better at this, and I'm helping other people. And so I'm kind of a little bit doing a bit of, you know, I'm cheating a bit in the book where I'm saying, well, I think that gamification in terms of points and badges, that doesn't work, but using ideas from really successful games could work. But it's just really hard to map them onto the real world because that's not how the real world is designed.
Well, and also we want to remind ourselves that games are more than points and levels and badges and, you know, and leveling up. And to me, those are some of the most superficial aspects of games. But the idea of like play as sort of subversively playing with structures, or creative play when you are giving players an expressive medium in which they can collaboratively sort of invent things. That there's all of these kind of, I often feel that gamification kind of strip mines games and leaves the soul of play behind.
Yeah, it sort of takes these mechanics that were invented by the games industry for, I think, pretty good purposes, like to sort of help people understand their progress, to help them understand new ways of playing the game, and just takes that as a whole thing. I just want to go and say, I just know this is being recorded. Elden Ring does have experience points and levels, so don't at me, but it's not like why people play it, because you can finish Elden Ring without like leveling up. So it's a bit like Legends of Zelda. So that's just for future YouTubers
who are the angry comments.
I know.
Anticipating the angry comments. And okay, I guess maybe the last thing to chat about a little bit, and then we'll open it up to questions. So start thinking about what you want to talk to Adrian about. Is I think this idea of the triumph of gamer culture, as you put it, is so interesting. And it's true that when I started teaching game design with Frank Lance, who founded the Game Center many years ago, I don't want decades ago, in the mid-90s, I would tell people I taught game design, they would look at you, what do you mean a class on game design? It's like a class on junk food. Like what does not compute, right? Like what, don't get it, because games were, as you say, they were for kids, they were violent, they were addictive, they were this kind of cluster of all of the worst. There was this poster up at ITP when Frank and I started teaching there, because Voyager, this sort of trendy CD-ROM company, had a contest every year called New Voices, New Visions. And they had this like incredible judges like Laurie Anderson and William Gibson that wrote Neuromancer. They would judge all of these projects, but the posters said something like, "Do not enter this contest if you feel that like advertising, shopping, and video games are the future of the information superhighway," or something like that. So it's just like games are just clearly. But you're completely right that somehow in the last 15 years or so, we've turned this weird corner where rather than games being kind of uncritically disparaged, now they are kind of uncritically elevated, right? And there's this kind of, which we kind of is a good thing, right? I mean, there's part of me that says, playing games is intrinsically good, like reading, like listening to music or playing music, right? It's part of this pantheon of essential human activities. But I guess the problem is that there's this strip mining of games for these kind of Black Mirror sort of dark patterns.
Well, it removes the ability to discriminate between different games, right? So, there's a lot, my sort of conspiracy theory about a lot of these studies that say playing video games are good for you is I think it's kind of a way to forestall any kind of regulation of stuff like loot boxes, and also to try and get games as a way to as a sort of prescribing games for like well-being. Anyway, I think the thing that is, obviously I play games all the time. I love games, but it's kind of ridiculous I have to say that because but because whenever anyone really criticizes games, just you sort of lose your friends. I remember I was, asked to be on this documentary called Panorama, like a very successful, very well-known BBC investigation show. And they're trying to do this piece about addiction in games. And so immediately everyone's like, addiction in games? Games can't be addictive. Like, you must hate games. You're just a horrible person. And so I went on the show and I remember, I was like, do not use the word addiction, but because people will get mad at me. And I said, some games I think are designed to get people playing for far longer and spending more money than they would like to, which sounds kind of uncontroversial. I think I have played Farmville and Farmville 2 and Cityville and all these things.
It's an obvious thing to say.
Yeah.
It's a common sense thing.
It's a common.
One could say about just about any app or game
or TV show or book or whatever.
Right.
And then afterwards, people are like, this guy is evil and an idiot. And no wonder you can find anyone other than me to go and talk about this on the show. So I think that
because people feel that how dare you criticize the thing I love?
Well, I think it's more just you letting the side down, basically.
Right.
You know, like
You're on our team.
yeah, you're either with us.
Rather than criticism being a sign of love,
Yeah.
it is seen as like it's this kind of simplistic binary world in which we live. Right?
Yeah.
You're for or against.
And so I think, you know, the thing is, it's just not. You know, I think, you know, if there's a message to that part of the book, it's just like some games are like well designed, and some games are probably badly designed, or designed, you know, in a way to manipulate people, and that's just not really surprising. But you know, like an example I use is Assassin's Creed Unity. And I really love Assassin's Creed. I love running across the rooftop, stabbing people in beautiful cities. And like in Unity, I remember opening the map for the world, and it was just like, it had like 500 icons on it. I was just like, I don't understand what's going on here. You want me to like, I am the kind of gamer, when I see that on a map, I'm like, I'm going to clean up the map. That's my job, right? And I spent like 20 hours on the main quest and like 60 hours doing all the nonsense of like, you know, finding cockades on the air and all this stuff. Just really boring. And I think some people would say to me, hey, Adrian, just stop caring about that. You know, just stop being the person who wants to clean up the map. I'm like, I can't stop that.
Yeah, well,
that's just like who I am.
As you told us, play reveals our core truths.
Yeah.
Which can then be marketed.
Right. And so, you know, I'm not saying that you shouldn't have side quests in Assassin's Creed. I'm just saying, just don't show them to me. Like, you know, like if I want to opt into that, that's great. But you know, it's a weird thing where people in the game industry, including me, will talk about how like powerful and emotional and how interactive and meaningful games can be, but then turn around and say, also, there's absolutely no way you could possibly use this in a way that would be against someone's interest. And it's just like, you can't like have it both ways. They're like amazing.
Right.
You know.
And that I think that's kind of the challenge that we all face. We're really we sculpt, you know, pleasure and desire, and I think that's kind of part of our palette of tools. And I don't know. My answer to that is just that it's important to be an educated, ethical human being and to think about your players in that sense and the ramifications and implications of what you do. And I think that your book is such a great manual for people that want to, and I think you don't take the easy route out in your book. I want to go into questions. There's so much more we can talk about. The one thing I'll say about Adrian's book is that it is an incredible just catalog, as you said, of all of these different realms of education and health. And one of the big images that you end the book with is your kind of rereading of indulgences, Christian indulgences, from like sort of like late medieval period. And this whole idea that in Christianity you could pay for or also do tasks that lessened your time in hell by a certain number of years. And it literally was a kind of gamification of your soul. And you talk about this sort of hardcore pilgrims who would sort of walk around with all these trinkets and things, and you know, I don't know if that made me sort of think that in a certain way, like these problems have just always been with humanity and are not going away. But it's anyway. So it's super fascinating.
Thank you. Yeah. Indulgences, definitely read up on that. You know, like the one thing I would say, I think, you know, when I read about that, I was like, oh, indulgences, those are things that you could buy to get out of hell. And actually, as it turns, you know, you kind of hear that and you think, wow, people are really stupid back in the medieval times. And you look at it, actually, no, it's way more complicated. It's way more interesting. People usually didn't pay for indulgences. They like did good things. And so it was like saying, hey, if you do a good thing, then you get time off hell. So is that bad? Maybe that's good.
Right.
You know, maybe indulgences are good.
Right.
So
that's sort of like maybe that is the game that Jay McGonigal is hoping for.
Yeah. We just need to like invent artificial hell, and then
or we're living in it.
Yeah.
Let's open it up to questions. Anyone have a question for Adrian? What's the best way to do this, Logan? Should I run back there with the mic and?
They can shout it. You can rephrase
Okay. Shout it out and we'll rephrase it. So hands up. We'll start here in front and work our way back.
Yeah. Hi. So my name is Matt. I'm a senior BFA at the Game Center.
So first thing I said, I love the talk, Adrian. It was kind of very reminiscent of like Mackenzie Work's game theory, kind of like a more updated commentary on that, which I thought was really refreshing. But my question kind of relies around one of the topics of game genres that you were mentioning in your talk, which was ARGs. And I think ARGs had this like really interesting evolution since it began with like, you know, promotional material like for the Blair Witch Project and like the Dark Knight Rises film stuff. And I think what made that interesting was that it was based off of like player interest, where it's like you're not coerced to do this, but if you are invested into like the IP or anything like that, then you are able to kind of like incorporate the everyday life into the game. But like what you mentioned now, with the more modern interpretation with like coercion and stuff, where it's like, you know, eat 5 Chipotle bowls, and get this trophy and 50% off your next order. Like, my question is like, do you truly think there is no middle ground because of that? Like, if there's like in terms of like interest in coercion, in the sense of like maybe finding workarounds with certain restrictions, such as like business efficiency practices or like I guess monetary like gain or something like that.
So let me just repeat the question for those on the stream and for the recording. The question is first following a lovely comparison to Mackenzie Work, also here at the Game Center. We also who came to give a talk at the Game Center. The question is about contemporary ARGs and the sort of evolution, and is there a middle ground between this kind of sort of dark pattern of coercive, trying to get this marketing promotion, versus the kind of very player-centric, quote-unquote immersive, let's say, or community-oriented games, and how are things evolving, and how do we navigate that, those of us interested in art design?
I mean, I think, you know, as it comes to like things like, you know, Starbucks, you know, gamification and retail gamification, like it works as long as you trust what the company is trying to do. And so, like, can an organization try and use gamification for good? I think it can, but it's going to be very situational. And if you think that the organization has your best interest at heart, or you know, long-term interests, then it can work. But the fact is, you know, we live in a world where people, you know, which is increasingly financialized, you know, and so it is hard for companies, for anyone to kind of resist those urges. You know, when I was running, you know, I get emails from companies, or I used to get emails from companies all the time saying, hey, will you sell us the location data of your players? We will give you like lots and lots of money. And everyone else was doing it, you know? And so it's hard to say no when someone says, I can make you rich forever, right? And so like that is the problem, you know? Like if you are going to be getting into some rewards app, they probably are motivated by just trying to make as much money from you as possible, right? To the point where you at least until you stop, you don't leave the product. So I am kind of suspicious of it. I do think that some companies do try, you know, and some companies are more ethical, but you know, that's a wider critique, I think.
I'm gonna go with the hands I saw before. Yeah.
Hi, I'm really interested in this idea of charismatic technology. So is the position, like with one laptop per child, the problem was that the laptops didn't work. Do you think the problem with gamification or with utopian gamification is that like gamification as a technology doesn't work, doesn't live up to its promise, like as in like velocity, brain training, etc., or is it that it works but there are other problems that sort of undermine it? Like in what sense is it being a charismatic technology mean that it is likely to fail?
So just repeat the question. Going on the concept of charismatic technology, is the essential problem that gamification doesn't work, since your definition of charismatic technology was dazzling you to not see the shortcomings? Or is it maybe that it does work, but there's something else going on that undermines the efficacy?
Well, I mean, the important thing about charismatic technology is a dazzle. Like it's, you know, if it's just like, get this app and it's going to make your commute 5% faster, that's not charismatic technology. That's just like a cool app. You know, if the promise is we're going to transform the world, then that is something that has a charisma about it. And the problem with one laptop per child is that it just, like, technically the laptops did turn on and you could use them, but they were completely inadequate to the task of transforming education. In fact, when you think about it, it's impossible to transform education in that way, like with a piece of hardware.
Right.
And similarly, it is true that I think there are some people who played some of these, utopian gamification, ARGs, who maybe did make changes in their lives, and they decided to be more conscious of the environment. Like, I'm sure that's true, but they had 500 players. It was obvious that it was never going to reach out to 1 billion people, and yet people still thought it worked. So that's kind of really the mismatch between the very visible results of these laptops. If you went to South America and you looked at how people used it, you would know that it was just never going to work. But people didn't want to look.
Right.
And that's because the dream was just so good.
Well, the name, what a dazzling name, 1 laptop per child. Are you against giving every child in the world a laptop? What kind of person are you, right? The dazzle's right there. But I totally agree with you. The slippage is that solving an education or poverty problem is about handing someone a technology without context, without who's using it, why and how are they learning about it, and what's the, it's like, okay, 1 notebook per child doesn't solve literacy. Right?
Well, there's a reason why it's technology and not something else, because it's just we're just going to manufacture this object and problem solved, which is, we know that's not how the world works.
But the dazzle extends to our mental image of the child receiving the technology, and a kind of like a consumerist fantasy of oh, if I give an impoverished child on the other side of the world shiny technology, they're gonna instantly transform into a citizen of an industrialized country, because look at them, they've got their own computer. Well, so of course they're sophisticated and educated and raising themselves out of their circumstances. It's a complete false fantasy.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I love that frame of charismatic technology around this problem.
There was one other thing which the author talks about, which is nostalgic design, which is basically the idea that people design things that they think will work on them. They know worked for them, and they just assume will work for everyone else. So a lot of the people behind the 1 laptop per child project were like, hey, when I was a kid, someone gave me a computer, and I taught myself, and I hated my teachers, and I hated school, so I taught myself programming, and now I'm rich, so everyone else should do that. And they just thought everyone else in the world should be like that.
Yeah, the problem is that it feels like it's so close to being right. There's something about that, about let's say systems thinking and play and collaboration and a less structured schooling and student-driven education. There's all these little elements of that vision which actually are insightful and could be put somewhere, but I just think it's really hard work to implement that in every context.
Yeah.
Let's keep going, and then we'll come here.
First, Adrian, I just want to say I really admire your work as both a practitioner and critic of games. That's the best, when it's coming from inside the house.
Thank you.
Like comedians who complain about comedy. It must be hard, but I really appreciate you do that. I wanted to ask though about pointsification. I think that there's game designers, when Eric says that they've stripped mined, the things from games and left the soul behind. We want to kind of kick the pointsification is of course it's so bad, all this stuff. So I was wondering what you make of games that are just that, like Cookie Clicker and the incremental games genre. That's sort of this weird opposite world of gamification, of these sort of coercive gamification. It's just that, but people do it for fun. So it's what do you make of that?
So to repeat the question, first of all, appreciating you as the loyal opposition, critiquing games from the inside. But in terms of pointsification, there is a whole genre of games that take that as the sort of aestheticize this sort of universe of points, like Candy Clicker and Universal Paperclips.
Yeah.
What do you make of games like that?
So I think that's kind of two genres there. One is commentary on incremental games, Universal Paperclips, where it's okay, this game has an end and it's got a political point, and that's kind of interesting. But then you have just unironically incremental games like Cookie Clicker. I think look, one way of looking at that is saying they're just evil and we should ban them. But I was reading up on this, like, the filmmaker Adam Curtis was like, I really like these clicker games because they're just like really like relaxing and kind of soporific, and like I like to like chill out at the end of the day. I like to play Candy Crush. I was like, you know what? That's fine. I don't have any problem with that. Like, why should I care if someone like plays like Candy Crush or plays like Cookie Clicker for like an hour a day if they're chilling out? Like, I don't. I am like a snob, I guess. Like, I will admit to saying like I think maybe like you should try and like you should try reading some books. You should try some other games. At the same time, I don't think it's the worst thing in the world. Like, like to be playing that. And like I played Animal Crossing a lot and probably should have been reading War and Peace or something. And so it's fine, But it's when I think if you had a game like Candy Crush or Cookie Clicker, and I noticed that someone had been playing it 8 hours a day, it probably should go and like throw up a warning saying, "Hey, like, are you okay?" I mean, seriously, like it's just like it seems like you're playing this a lot, and like, like, is everything all right? Because you can take it to extremes.
Nusha, did you have a question?
Yes. So I feel like gamification in the corporate world gets kind of uniquely seen as like uniquely evil. When we see art in advertising, like very beautiful art, we don't think, oh, how could you use art to this mean? Or when we see like very clever copy in an advertisement, we don't think, oh, how could you do that to literature? But when we see a game, we think like, how could you take something so kind of sacred and use that for this end? So why do you think that games are treated as like it's uniquely unacceptable to use them for advertising versus other forms of culture?
Do you wanna-
So, thank you. Yeah, so the idea is, the question is about the kind of special status of people getting riled up about games used for advertising and a kind of misuse of this medium. And we don't necessarily see that same opposition to, product placement in film or the moving image. Why do games have this kind of status?
I mean,
or do they?
Well, I don't know that they do. I mean, I think that there are people out there who really do hate advertising, actually, and who do object to art, beautiful art being used for advertising. And I think that you have some cities. I want to say like Buenos Aires or Rio, which have banned display advertising. They're just like we hate this and we don't want it, and so. It's not a common position because people are just kind of used to it, But like I would say, there are some people who don't like that. Conversely, I think most people don't seem to be that bothered by gamification in the workplace, And I think that's partly through kind of inattention. Some people just like it. The distinction that I would make is that I think that it's much more. I think the level of control is much more direct, right? And so. I think that the way that some companies are using gamification in the workplace is basically as a replacement for an interaction with a manager. And so instead of having a manager come to you and saying, hey, you did a bad job today and I want you to work harder tomorrow, now the game says, oh, you kind of didn't meet your achievement, but you could go and try and level up tomorrow, bad luck. And I guess I just really object to that, because I think that at least you can sort of talk back to the manager and say, yeah, fuck off. But like, with a game, you're like, at the moment, people just maybe haven't realized that the game is just rigged in a lot of these cases. And so, that's where I find it more difficult. I guess it's also because it's newer, and so like I just get more annoyed at newer things. So yeah.
But I think that this question, and I think because of time we need to wrap it up. But this question really does get at the heart of, for me, what we were talking about earlier and what your book is about, which is, okay, the manager's replaced by the game, which is telling you to sort of do another mission. But if you think about the kid in the candy bar and cleaning up the room, what that really means is that the whole company is no longer actually focused on the intrinsic value of the work, even if it's making money or educating people or whatever it is, studying, doing some kind of research. Instead, the work starts being oriented more towards these strange extrinsic rewards, and that's, I guess for me, that's what's disturbing. But to not end on a negative note, that's sort of like, that's why we're so grateful for Adrian, for you, for your games, for your thinking, for your kind of public intellectual persona, and for this amazing new book you've been played, because you're, I think that it's so important that, as Alexander said, that we have, the comics in the house that are kind of calling out the hypocrisy, that really know how these things work. And it's been incredibly delightful to hear you talk about your ideas and to dialogue with you tonight. Please join me, everybody, and thank. Sorry.
I'm gonna take one question from Twitch.
Oh yeah.
Yes, hold that applause. So I saw that there were other hands here. We'll take one question from Twitch. Thank you, Naomi.
Just to be fair to
Yes, thank you. No, that's great.
So this is from Njima, who's asking.
Who's asking if you answer 5 more questions, Njima will bribe you with a no.
Can the cat be put back in the box? This type of gamification, and or is there any good that you think will come from the gamification cat being out of the box? Like, is there a silver lining here?
All right, just to repeat the question from Twitch stream. Thank you, Twitch stream. If the cat out of the box, is there any good that can come out of that in terms of gamification of running rampant through culture right now? Or if the cat can't be put back in, is there any good that can come out of it?
I mean, there's probably like an accelerationist aspect to this, where you say like if we sort of maybe like accelerates the explosion of coercive and centralized management structures, that would be nice. I don't know. I don't feel an urge to put a happy face on it, I guess. And I just think it's bad, and I think that the workers should have more control over their work life and environment. And if they all choose to go and add gamification to their workplace, great, good for you. But I think people will realize it's all kind of stupid, but in 30 years time. But I just hope that the book maybe turns out into 29 years time. So that's really the goal.
All right, and thank you for ending on a strong statement for workers' rights too. Thank you, Adrian, so much for a great talk. Thanks everybody for tuning in online, and have a good evening. We'll see you at the next Game Center lecture series event.